I had swept that yard for 19 years before anybody on it learned my name, and even then it was an accident. They called me the keeper when they called me anything. More often they called me nothing, because I was a fixture, the way the blast wall was a fixture, the way the rack of practice rifles bolted to the south wall was a fixture. A thing that had always been there and would always be there and required no thought. I cleaned the firing lanes. I oiled the actions on the old projectile weapons the Academy still kept for ceremony and for the few trials that needed real recoil. I painted over the scorch marks on the long mark when they got bad enough that even the Shared noticed, which was rarely, because the Shared don't see scorch marks. They see lattice readings. They see the numbers that come off a cadet's spine after the writing takes. The wall behind the cadet could be on fire and they would be reading the curve. I should explain the writing, because none of the rest makes sense without it, and because I have learned that my own people, when I tell this, want to understand the machine before they will believe the boy. The Shared do not learn the way you and I learn. I want to be careful here because it is easy to say that and have it land as a small thing, a difference of method, and it is not a small thing. It is the whole bone of them. When a young Shared is to be made into a gunner or a pilot or a field cutter or any of the 100 trades their war academies turn out, they are not taught. They are written. A rated master, someone who already holds the skill, certified, measured, his own lattice mapped down to the twitch, is laid in a cradle beside the cadet, and an inscriptor runs the conferral and the pattern of the master's competence is copied, transcribed, burned into the young one's lattice the way you'd copy a file from one drive to another. It takes an afternoon. The cadet stands up knowing how to shoot the way the master knew how to shoot. Not approximately, exactly. Every cadet written off the same master shoots identically, down to the way they settle their weight, because they are all running the same copied motion. It is, I will tell you plainly, an extraordinary thing to watch the first time. I watched a room of fledglings who had never held a weapon stand up after a single afternoon and put rounds through the center of the mark at 400 meters, all of them, every one, a perfect grouping that looked like one shooter had fired it 40 times. I had spent 2 years of my own young life learning to do worse than that. I understood, watching it, why they had won so much of the galaxy. You do not have to raise soldiers. You raise one, then you print. And I understood, eventually, the rot under it, but that came later, and it came through the boy. His name was Pell. The Shared never gave him a proper cadet designation because you do not number a thing you intend to discard, so he was just Pell, the human recruit, the one the placement office had taken in on some quota arrangement. I never learned the shape of a treaty obligation, a gesture, a box ticked in an office on some other world. There had been a human at Karen Vale before. That was me, though almost no one alive on that yard knew it, and the ones who did had stopped thinking of me as a person years ago. So when the boy arrived, I was the only one who looked at him and saw what he was, which was a kid who had signed up to be a soldier among people who had no machinery for making him one. Because here is the thing the placement office did not understand or did not care to. The conferral does not take on a human. Our lattices, if you even want to call them that, do not accept the right. Something about the way we're put together, I never had the science, and the Shared who did never bothered to explain it to a janitor, but a human mind will not hold a copied pattern. You can lay us in the cradle all day. Nothing transcribes. We come up blank. So to the Shared, a human is unwritable, and unwritable in their tongue and their bones is the same word as useless. There is no daylight between the two ideas for them. A mind you cannot write is a mind that cannot be made into anything. It is defective stock. You scrap the slot. I knew all of that the morning they brought Pell down to the long mark for his assessment, and I knew exactly how it was going to go, and I had decided, the way I had decided about everything for 19 years, that it was not mine to interfere with. I had a broom. I had lanes to clear. I had learned a long time ago that the surest way for an old human relic to keep his quiet corner of an alien academy was to want nothing and say nothing and be, as much as he could manage, furniture. I want you to understand that I was very good at being furniture. It had cost me a great deal to get that good, and I was not, that morning, planning to spend it. Instructor Master Velorin ran the assessment himself, which surprised me, because Velorin did not run assessments. Velorin was the senior instructor of the whole academy, the man who held the master patterns in his keeping, the certifying voice on what a Karen Vale gunner was. He was old for a charade, which is a different kind of old than I am. They go translucent at the edges as they age, the chitin thinning until you can see the slow architecture of them working underneath, and Velorin was very translucent. He had been writing cadets since before I came to the yard. He had, I think, written 10,000 of them. He believed in the conferral the way other beings believe in gravity. It was not an opinion to him. It was the floor he stood on. He came down to the long mark to assess the human personally. I worked out later because he wanted the slot closed cleanly. A human on the rolls was an irregularity, and Velorin did not like irregularities on his rolls. He wanted to lay the boy in the cradle, demonstrate to the placement office that the stock would not take the right, and have it on the record in his own certified hand. Unwritable, scrap the slot. Tidy. Final. They cradled the boy out in the open, on the assessment pad at the head of the firing lanes, where I happened to be working a stiff bolt out of one of the old rifles with a punch and a small hammer, 20 meters off, beneath their notice. I watched them lay Pell down. I watched the instructor's apprentices set the contacts along his spine. I watched the boy hold still and try to look like he wasn't afraid, which he was, and which I did not hold against him. Because the first time you let an alien lay copper on your backbone and tell you it's going to put a skill into your head, you'd be a fool not to be afraid. And Pell was not a fool. He was just a kid with the wrong kind of mind for the place he'd been sent. The right failed, of course. It was always going to fail. The lattice reader screamed its flat, empty tone, no take, no take, no take, and the apprentices looked at Velorin. And Velorin looked at the boy the way you'd look at a tool that had turned out to be the wrong size for the job, with no malice in it at all, which was worse than malice. "The stock is unwritable," Velorin said. He said it to his apprentice for the record, not to the boy. He did not say it to the boy because in his understanding there was no boy there to say it to. There was a failed right and an open slot. Note it. There is nothing here to make a gunner of. Scrap the slot. And Pell, I have to tell you what Pell did, because it is the reason I put the hammer down. Pell, lying there with the contacts still on his spine and the flat dead tone of his own failure still ringing off the blast wall, said, "Then teach me." Velorin did not understand the words. Not the language, he had the language. The idea, teach me. It did not parse. There is no teaching in the conferral. You write or you don't. A thing either takes the pattern or it is unwritable. The notion that competence could be built into a mind from the outside slowly, by hand, over time, by some process other than copying, it was not that Velorin rejected it. It had simply never been an option his species needed to invent, because the machine had always been there to make invention unnecessary. He heard a defective tool make a defective tool's noise, and he turned to go. I put the hammer down on the bench. I remember the small sound it made, and how loud it was to me. "You can't write him," I said. "I heard, but the boy asked you a question and you didn't answer it." The whole pad turned and looked at the keeper, which had not happened in years. Velorin's eyes, they have a lot of eyes, the charade and the front pair are the ones that read you, came around to me slowly. "The keeper," he said, the way you'd identify a smell. "This is yard business. Return to your lanes." "He asked you to teach him," I said. "I can do that. If the academy's got no use for the slot, give it to me. I'll have the broom done by 6th bell and the lanes are mine after dark anyway. Costs you nothing. You've already scrapped him. You can't waste what you've thrown out." I want to be honest about why I said it, because for years afterward people who heard the story wanted it to be a noble thing. An old soldier seeing himself in a young one, a torch and a flame and all of that. Some of that's true. But the plainest truth is that I had been furniture for 19 years and I was tired. And there was a boy on the ground who had just been told he was nothing in front of a whole yard. And I knew exactly how that felt, because I had been told the same thing in a different language a long time ago, and I had not had anybody put a hammer down for me. That's the whole of it. There wasn't a plan. There was a boy, and there was the way it felt. Velorin considered me the way you'd consider a wall that had spoken. Then he did the thing that I think he believed was contempt, and was actually the most generous thing he ever did, which was to find the entire proposal so beneath notice that he granted it just to be rid of it. "The unwritable will instruct the unwritable," he said to his apprentice for the record with the faint click that passes for a Shered's dry amusement. "Note it, the slot remains scrapped. The keeper may dispose of his hours as he likes." And to me almost kindly the way you'd correct a child's harmless error. "You cannot make a gunner without the pattern, keeper. There is no pattern to make him with, but the lanes are yours after dark. Waste them as you please." He left. The apprentices peeled the dead contacts off Pell's spine and left too, and they did not look at the boy, because there was nothing on their rolls to look at. I picked up my broom and finished the lane. Then I walked over to where Pell was sitting up on the assessment pad, rubbing the marks the contacts had left, looking at the dirt. "Get up," I said. "We start tonight." He looked up at me. "You really know how to do it, without the machine." "Son," I said, "the machine is how they do it. There's an older way. It's slower and it hurts, and most of what you'll feel for the first month is stupid. But yes, I know how to make a man who can shoot. I learned it the way I'm going to teach it to you, by hand. I should tell you what I knew, so you understand it wasn't a miracle. I had been a marksman, a real one in a real war on the wrong end of a treaty line, long enough ago that the war I fought in is a paragraph in a history file now, and the side I fought for doesn't exist as a flag anymore. I'm not going to lay the whole of it out, partly because it is not the story and partly because there are 19 years of yard between me and that man, and I do not always recognize him. But I will tell you the relevant part, which is that I learned to shoot from a man named Aldous Crane, who learned it from a woman whose name I never knew, who learned it from somebody before her, in a line going back further than anybody bothered to write down. Hand to hand. Stance and breath and the long, boring patience of doing a thing 10,000 times until your body owns it and your mind can stand back and watch the wind. That's the difference, and I am going to put it as plain as I can because it is the bone of everything that happened after. When the Shered write a cadet, they copy the master's motion. The settle, the hold, the squeeze, the follow-through, the whole physical pattern, perfect, identical. What they cannot copy, because the master himself usually can't say it out loud, is the why. The reason the hold is where it is. The 1,000 small corrections the master's body learned to make that he no longer notices he's making. The judgment. A written cadet shoots exactly like the master shot, under the conditions the master was measured in. Lay him a clean lane, a still day, a fixed mark at a known range, and he is flawless, all of them. A printed sheet of flawless. Change one thing the pattern didn't account for, and there is nobody home to adjust, because the cadet never built the understanding underneath the motion. He was handed the answer without ever being shown the problem. A hand-taught man is slower to make and worse at the start, and for a long while plainly inferior. But he built the thing himself, from the ground, and so he owns the ground. When the wind changes, he knows in his body that it's the wind and not him, because he spent 6 weeks learning the difference the hard way. He can adjust because he understands what he's adjusting from. The Shered had never needed to know this, because they had never lost their masters. Why would you teach from nothing when you can copy from a master who already exists? It is more efficient by every measure. And it is, for 1,000 years of peace and steady supply, entirely correct. Right up until the day you need a thing your masters were never measured doing, and you reach for the pattern, and the pattern isn't there, and you discover that nobody in your whole civilization remembers how to build one from scratch, because the machine made remembering unnecessary, And a skill that is only ever copied and never understood is a skill that can only ever do exactly what it has already done. I knew none of this as a theory the night I started teaching Pell. I just knew the boy couldn't be written, and that the old way was the only way left for him, and that I happened to be the last man on that world who carried it. The first month was as stupid as I'd promised. I did not let him fire for 2 weeks. That nearly broke him, and it nearly broke me, because every night the written cadets were out on the day lanes putting perfect groupings through the mark, and every night I had Pell standing in an empty lane after dark holding an unloaded rifle, learning where his own bones went. Stance, breath, the way the weight sits through the hips and not the shoulders. How to go still, not stiff still, which is a different thing and takes longer to learn than anything else, and which the Conferral cannot teach because stillness isn't emotion, it's the absence of the wrong ones. This is pointless, he said on about the 9th night, not angry, tired. He'd watched the written cadets again that afternoon. They can all shoot, I can't even hold the thing right yet. Maybe Velorin was right, maybe there's just nothing here to make a gunner out of. I let him stand with that for a moment. Then I took the rifle out of his hands and held it up the way he'd been holding it. Look at your grip, I said. You've got it choked up here because you think tight means controlled. Watch. I let the muzzle drift, exaggerated it, the small wander that a death grip puts into a barrel. Now watch. I dropped the hold to where it belonged, loose where it should be loose, locked where it should be locked, and the muzzle went dead still. You see the difference? Yeah. A written cadet can't see that difference because nobody ever showed it to him as a difference. He was handed the right grip already finished, and he never knew there was a wrong one to compare it to. You're going to spend 2 weeks finding out what wrong feels like in your own hands. It's going to feel like falling behind. It isn't. It's the only part that lasts. The day something goes wrong out there, and on a real lane, son, something always goes wrong. You'll be the only one on the line who knows it when he feels it. He didn't believe me. That was fine. I didn't need him to believe me. I needed him to come back the next night, and he did, and that was the whole of the discipline. He kept coming back. The one thing I never once had to teach him, the thing the placement office's quota arrangement had accidentally sent me, was that the boy did not quit. He was wrong-handed and slow and a year behind, and he kept walking down to that dark lane night after night and picking up the rifle and finding out what wrong felt like. And a man who will do that, I can work with. A man who will do that, I can make into anything. The academy noticed, in the way you notice a stray animal that keeps coming back to the same corner. The written cadets had a name for the after-dark lane by the 2nd month, the dead slot. They called it the keeper's dead slot, and they would come by sometimes to watch the human and the relic do their slow, stupid pantomime in the empty lane, and they would make the clicking sound that is a Sherad laughing, and go back to their perfect groupings. Pell hated that more than anything. He was a kid. Of course he did. One night a knot of them lingered longer than usual clicking, and I watched the boy's jaw go tight and his grip choke up again, the death grip, the wander coming back into the muzzle. Lane's yours, not theirs, I said low. You're shooting their opinion right now instead of the mark. Put it down. They think we're a joke. We are a joke, I said. To them, you know what a joke is. A joke is a thing they've already decided they understand. The most useful thing in the galaxy to be, son, is a joke that nobody's looking at too hard. Let them laugh. A man who's laughing isn't measuring you. Now find your hold. He found his hold. The cadets got bored and left, the way they always did, because a joke isn't interesting once it stops reacting. And I taught the boy the second lesson under the first one, which was the one I'd spent 19 years living. That being underestimated is not a wound to nurse. It is a wall to work behind. In the 3rd month I let him fire, and he was bad, and that was correct, and I told him so, and he took it, because by then he trusted the slowness. By the 5th month he was not bad. By the 5th month he could put a tight group through the mark on a still night at 300 meters, which was not as good as a written cadet's first afternoon, and which was worth 100 times more, though there was not yet anybody but me who could see why. And here is where I have to bring in the wind, because the wind is what broke it open. The long mark sat in a cut between two ridgelines, and when the season turned, the cut funneled a crosswind down the lanes that came and went in gusts, unpredictable, shoving a round sideways at 400 meters by a hand's width or more. The written cadets shot in the calm seasons. The pattern they were written from had been measured in still air. Veloran's master gunner, whoever he'd been, had been mapped on a windless day a generation ago, and so every cadet at Karen Vale was, without a single one of them knowing it, a still-air shooter and only a still-air shooter. The Conferral had handed them a windless answer to a windy galaxy, and nobody had ever noticed because nobody scheduled the live trials for the windy season. Why would you? You shoot in the calm. You always have. I scheduled Pell's nights for the wind. I did it on purpose, and I want the credit for it, because it is the one genuinely clever thing I did in the whole business, and the rest was just patience. I put the boy out on the lanes on the gusty nights, and I taught him to read the cut, to watch the dust, to feel the push on his own cheek, to hold a half-second for the lull or to lead into the shove, to understand in his body that the round and the wind were two different things, and that his job was to do arithmetic between them. It is the hardest thing I know how to teach. It cannot be copied at all, because it is an emotion. It's a conversation with the world that changes every second. The Conferral could no more write it than it could write a sense of humor. It took the rest of the season. By the end of it, Pell could put a round through the mark in a crosswind that would have walked a written cadet's shot clean off the target board, and he could tell you after exactly what the wind had done and exactly what he'd done back. He owned the ground all the way down. He was, by then, and I say this as the man who made him, who knows precisely what he was and wasn't, a real marksman. Slower made and worse on paper than any cadet on that yard, and the only one of them who could actually shoot. Nobody knew it but me, and it would have stayed that way, the keeper's joke in the dead slot, except that the Academy ran its annual demonstration in the windy season that year, for the first time in anybody's memory, because the visiting fleet officers who were the audience for it could only come on the dates they could come, and the dates fell wrong, and somebody in an office decided the wind wouldn't matter. I almost didn't put him in. I want to be honest about that too. The demonstration was for the written cadets, a showcase of the Academy's product, the perfect printed groupings, in front of fleet brass deciding where to send the year's graduates. There was no slot in it for a scrapped human and a yard keeper. But there was an open lane portion at the end, a formality, where any registered cadet could request a demonstration shot, and Pell was technically still registered, because Veloran's scrap the slot had been a verdict, not a deletion, and nobody had ever bothered to file the paperwork that would have actually struck him from the rolls. A scrapped slot that nobody finishes scrapping is still, on the books, a slot. So I put him in. I filled out the request in my own hand, keeper's authorization, after dark, and I did not tell the boy until the morning of, because I did not want him shooting their opinion of him for a week beforehand. I told him an hour before. He went pale and then he went still, the good still, the still I'd spent 6 months building into him, and he said, "Windy day." And I said, "Windiest of the year." And something moved at the corner of his mouth that on a written cadet would have been impossible, because they don't make that face, the face of a man who has been handed exactly the problem he secretly hoped for. The written cadets shot first. They were beautiful. I will not take that from them. Lane after lane of fledglings stepping up and putting flawless groupings through the mark, identical, printed, the whole sheet of them shooting like one long-dead master shooting 40 times, and the fleet officers clicked their approval, and Veloran stood at the head of the pad with his thin, translucent dignity and watched his life's work perform. And then the wind came up. It had been gusting all morning, but it came up properly during the middle of the demonstration. A real shove down the cut, the dust walking sideways across the lanes. And I watched it happen, and I watched nobody on the pad understand what they were watching. Because to understand it, you would have had to know that there was a thing called wind that the pattern didn't account for, and not one Sherrod on that pad had ever had to learn it. The next cadet stepped up. Flawless form, the printed settle, the printed hold. He fired. The gust took the round and walked it a full hand's width off the center, and he fired again exactly the same because there was nobody home to adjust, and it walked off again, the identical error, a perfect grouping, a perfect distance from where it was supposed to be. He did not understand why. You could see it, the small confusion in him, the body doing everything right and the result coming out wrong, and no tool anywhere in his written mind for figuring out the gap, because the gap was the one thing the master had never been measured against. He fired a third time, off again. He stepped back and the next cadet stepped up, and the same thing happened, the same beautiful useless grouping in the same wrong place, because they were all the same shooter and the same shooter could not read wind. The fleet officer's clicking had stopped. Velorin had gone very still in his own old way. I saw the moment it reached him. The moment the senior Instructor of Karen Vale understood that his entire product line was, in front of the people who decided its future, failing in unison at a thing none of them could even perceive, and that he had no idea why and no pattern to fix it with, because the only way to fix it was a thing his people had let die 1,000 years ago. That was when I put my hand on Pell's shoulder and said, "Open lane, go." He walked out to the line. The whole pad turned and looked, the way they'd turned and looked the day Velorin called him unwritable, except this time it was different. This time there was something at stake on the pad that they did not have an answer to, and into that silence walked the keeper's joke, the human from the dead slot in front of the fleet. He took his stance, the good loose-lock stance I'd spent 6 months building into his bones. He went still. He watched the dust. I knew exactly what he was doing because I had taught him to do it. He was having the conversation, reading the cut, feeling the push on his cheek, doing the arithmetic between the round and the wind. He waited. A written cadet cannot wait. The pattern fires on the pattern's timing. Pell waited for the cut to tell him what it was doing, and when it told him, he leaned half a hair into the shove and held for the half second I'd taught him to hold for, and he fired. Dead center. The wind walked, and the round walked with it, exactly as much as he'd told it to, into the middle of the mark. He fired again, and the gust had changed, and so his hold changed, a different correction, a living one, and the round went dead center again by a different road. He fired a third time into a lull he'd seen coming before it came, and a fourth into a shove, and every round found the center of the mark by its own separate negotiation with the air, and not one of them looked like the one before it, because he was not running a pattern. He was reading the world and answering it shot by shot. The way a man does, the way the oldest line of marksmen going back further than anybody bothered to write down, had always done it, hand to hand, down to a kid in a scrapped slot at the edge of a war academy that had no machinery for making him. When he lowered the rifle, the pad was silent, not the contempt silence, the other one. Velorin came down off the head of the pad. The fleet officers were watching him, and he knew it, and he came down anyway, the thin old translucent man who had written 10,000 cadets, and he stood looking at the human in the open lane, and at the mark 40 rounds of perfect printed failure had walked off of, and one scrapped human had hit 4 times by 4 different roads. "This is not in the pattern," he said. It was not quite a question. It was a man's whole understanding of the world asking to be told it was wrong. "No," I said. I'd come up beside the boy. "It isn't. You can't write it. I told you that the first day. You can't write wind." He was unwritable. He still is. You could lay him in that cradle right now and get the same dead tone. The machine can't put a thing into him. I let that sit. I didn't put it into him. I built it out of him, 6 months after dark by hand. There's no copying it in Instructor. There never was. That's the part your people forgot you ever needed to know. And Velorin, I will give him this at the end, the same thing I gave him at the beginning. did the most that a man can do who has just watched the floor he stood on for 1,000 years turn out to have a door in it. He did not rage, and he did not deny it. He looked at the mark a long time. Then he said the thing that told me he'd actually understood, which was also the thing that told me how far his people had to come. "Then we will confer the skill from you," he said. "We will lay you in the cradle and map the pattern and write it into the rest. If the keeper holds it, the keeper can be copied." I almost laughed. I didn't, because the man was trying in the only grammar he had. "No," I said. "You're still hearing it as a pattern. It isn't one. There's no map to take. What the boy has isn't a motion you can copy off me. It's 6 months of finding out what wrong feels like in his own hands until his own body could tell the difference. You can't write that. You can't shortcut it. There's exactly one way to put it into another mind, Instructor, and your whole civilization let it die because the machine made it look like a waste of time. And that way is, you teach it," I said, "slow, by hand, one at a time. You take the ones the machine throws out, the unwritable, the defective stock, the scrap slots, and instead of disposing of them, you stand in an empty lane after dark and you build the thing into them from the ground up. And it takes months. And most of what they feel at the start is stupid. And at the end of it, you have a soldier who owns the ground all the way down and can do the thing your patterns never can. It's slower than the machine by every measure." I looked at the mark, 4 dead center rounds by 4 different roads. "And it's the only thing that works when the world does something your masters were never measured against, which the world always, eventually, does." Velorin was quiet for a long time. The fleet officers were quiet behind him. I think he understood, finally and completely, that the thing standing in the dead slot was not a joke and never had been, that the Academy had, the whole time, sitting in plain sight under a broom, the last living carrier of a skill his people had thrown away, and that they had nearly disposed of the one human who could have given it back to them, and would have, except the boy didn't quit and an old relic was tired enough to put down a hammer. "What do you want, Keeper?" he said at last. Not a threat. A man with a door in his floor asking the one being who knew where it led. I thought about it. 19 years of furniture. I found I didn't want much. "Stop scrapping the slots," I said. "The unwritable ones. The ones the machine can't take. Send them to me. There won't be many and most of them won't have what the boy has, but some of them will, and right now you're throwing every one of them out because you've got no machinery for them. I'm the machinery. I'm old and there's one of me, so you'd best let me teach a few of them to teach while I've still got the years. That's all. Give me the dead slots and the dark lanes and leave us alone, the way you've been leaving us alone, except now you know what we're doing out there." He gave me the dead slots and the dark lanes. He filed it himself in his own certified hand, and I have wondered since whether that was the hardest thing the old Instructor ever wrote, a line on the rolls making official, after 1,000 years, that the Academy would keep what the machine couldn't write and let a human teach it the old way. I never asked him. We were not friends. But we were, after that, 2 old men who had each had to learn that the thing he'd built his life on had a door in it, and there is a kind of respect in that doesn't need to be friendship. The boy made rate. Real rate, certified, the first hand-taught marksman to come off Karen Vale in longer than their records ran. The fleet took him. I won't pretend I wasn't proud. In the grave, quiet way an old man is proud, which is mostly just relief that the thing you spent yourself on stood up and walked. But that is not the picture I keep. The picture I keep is from a few weeks after, in the dead slot, after dark, the wind coming down the cut. They'd sent me the first of them, a scrapped slot, an alien cadet whose lattice had rejected the right, defective stock. Useless. Exactly the kind of thing Velorin would have disposed of a year before. A frightened young Shared who'd been told his whole short life that a mind that couldn't be written was a mind that couldn't be made into anything, standing in an empty lane holding a rifle wrong, with the death grip, choking it up because he thought tight meant controlled. And it was not me who took the rifle out of his hands to show him the difference. It was Pell. The boy had asked to stay on between fleet rotations for exactly this. He took the rifle and held it up the wrong way and let the muzzle wander, and then he dropped the hold to where it belonged and let it go dead still, and he said, "You see the difference?" My words in his mouth to the next one they'd thrown away, and the frightened young sheriff said yes, and Pell said, "You're going to spend 2 weeks finding out what wrong feels like in your own hands. It's going to feel like falling behind. It isn't, it's the only part that lasts." I stood in the door of the dead slot and watched the thing I carried go on past me, hand to hand, into a line that would now run forward instead of stopping. And I picked up my broom, because the lane still needed clearing, and a man my age has learned to take his piece in small grave portions and not ask for the large ones. The wind came down the cut. In the empty lane the boy I'd built was building the next one, and I went back to sweeping the yard I'd kept for 19 years before anybody learned my name, content, for once, to be furniture. The kind that holds a thing up in plain sight where nobody thinks to look until the day it's needed.